So the mulatta became a figure around which a contest emerged from the 1850s at least forward. And she was indeed a figure which signified the possibility of liberation, a figure which signified the possibility of enlisting massive amounts of support in the fight against slavery. And of course, there were the prominent mulattoes like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, who would make their marks in different ways at different points of this liberationist record. All right. So I asked Bogle to reconsider what he has to say about the mulatta and about mulattoes in general. As I've asked him to reconsider what he says and thinks about bucks. And when you do that, you have to reconsider the figure of the mammy. The mammy is in large measure a postbellum phenomena in Southern literature. Again, it has to do with the presence of the black woman in slavery. I was never attracted to black women or seduced by black women, because the black woman with whom I had most contact was sexless. I remember my dear old mammy, right, who taught me this and taught me that. Well, we now know that indeed in most of the big houses in the plantation system, the black women in those houses who were in fact slaves were not middle-aged or old women, they were young women. And we know that from a variety of records, including the diaries of the manor women who went mad, who became insane because they were so jealous of the black woman who had taken the affection of their husbands, and sometimes their sons and their brothers, etc. So the mammy stands in for young black women in general and mixed ancestry black women in particular. You all know the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally, was it Sally Hemings? You know that Sally Hemings came to the Jefferson household at Monticello as part of his wife's dowry. You know that Sally Hemings was his wife's sister. You know that Sally Hemings' father was the father-in-law of Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, etc. All right. So you knew that story, and you knew that story was a scandal in Jefferson's lifetime. But it was a scandal only because of Jefferson's prominence. It wasn't a scandal because of what it revealed about the nature of the relationships between the slave-owning class and their female slaves in particular. I kid my students, I say, you know, the old nickel has what, Jefferson on one as a head, on the other side is Monticello. And you can't see the secret staircase between Jefferson's bedroom and the slave-dominated kitchen. But it's there, it's on your nickel. So pay some attention to what things are being spoken in front of your faces. All right. So Bogle produces an array of possibilities, which are, to a certain degree, naturalized by a construction of slavery, which is historically not only false, but lazy. All right. So what I was trying to do was to suggest, as I had done in Black Marxism, that the emergence of a certain kind of industry in the bath of a racial culture makes it possible for that industry, we're talking about the film industry, to sustain misconceptions, to sustain not simply stereotypes, but constructions of the past, of history, which are indeed, as I suggest in my title, forgeries of history. So I went from there into the subsequent constructions that were found in the silent film era and the early film era of sound. One of the other things I wanted to talk about in terms of the film industry was indeed why the invention of Hollywood took place. Race is used to conceal power relations, just as the invention of the notion of Hollywood is used to conceal power relations. I argue in Forgeries that Hollywood existed between 1914 and 1927, and it stopped existing after that. It ceased to exist after that. That it was overtaken by forms of capital which were more powerful than the studios, and as a consequence, the studios became ciphers for a different form of capital. I say that because it's important for us to understand certain genres emerging during the talking era. And I specifically mean by that the jungle film. You already have what Ed Guerrero calls the plantation film to signify slavery. The plantation film most completely articulated by 1915 by The Birth of a Nation. Slavery was a joyful moment. Slaves took a great deal of pleasure in slavery. Slaves had so much energy after a day of planting or picking or what have you that they could dance and entertain each other and anybody else who happened to be around to spectate. Right? That's how Birth of a Nation portrayed slavery. And the plantocrat was, in fact, an enormous nobility. And consequently, when the world turned unnatural during Reconstruction, when poor whites and blacks dominated governance of several states and introduced such iniquities as public education in South Carolina or Georgia or what have you, right? It was necessary for the old nobility to reclaim its rightful place as the dominant class in the society, so Birth of a Nation maintains. And it did it because it was necessary to protect the white woman from black rapists. That was the precipitant. And ultimately, the agency that they organized was the Ku Klux Klan. So the nobility organizes the Ku Klux Klan to protect white females, and of course to put blacks back into that status in society to which our nature assigns us. So we already had the plantation genre well established by the time of sound. But there was another genre which was lurking on the outside during the silent film era, which is called the jungle film. And the first important jungle film of the talkie era was a film called Trader Horn. And like the mulatta and like the mammy, Trader Horn has a kind of complex backstory. Living in South Africa is an English woman named Alpharetta Lewis. And Alpharetta Lewis is involved in the African industrial workers movement. And she comes across a tinkerer, a salesman of tin works, named Aloysius Smith, who eventually sits down having tea with her and begins to tell her stories of his young, he's 60s or in his 70s by now, in the 1920s, late 1920s. She begins to hear the tales of his young adulthood, his adventures in West Africa. And among his adventures in West Africa is his encounter with a white woman, or a white girl, who was raised by Africans. The book becomes a bestseller in 1928 in South Africa, the UK, the United States, and MGM takes over the book contract to transform it into a film. They decide to send their crew to East Africa to film it. There have been other film crews in Africa, but none of them had the capacity that this film crew does in 1930, and that is to bring sound to the African forest, the African rivers. So they make this film, Trader Horn, and it's a 2-hour film, the print that I've seen. Halfway into the film, 1 hour and 8 minutes into the film, the white heroine is introduced. Right? Nina, the cruelest woman in Africa, the posters say, the ad campaign says. And she proceeds to evince her cruelty. But staying away from any kind of close inspection of Trader Horn, I want to say that in effect, what we have with the jungle film is an additional element of a racial regime, and that is the notion that blacks are savages. The next year comes Tarzan. The year after that, Tarzan and his mate. The same year, Ngagi. 2 years later, King Kong. This is important.